Hi, welcome to our second lecture of our prehistoric art series, and let's talk about Neolithic. So Neolithic, Neo means new, lithic means stone. So we start to enter the new stone age, if you will. Now we talked about with our Paleolithic climate, it was extremely inhospitable. We're going through an ice age, it's difficult to survive. Our people are nomadic, they're hunter-gatherers. The fact that we have these artworks such as the sculpture that we studied, as well as the cave art, attest to their importance, just because there was no time for doodling, if you will. We know that they were important because life was so harsh. There wasn't time to do anything besides survive or create images that hopefully enabled survival, etc. But now we're entering a new time period, and much of this is defined by the climate change. And so we have global warming that's occurring. The glaciers start to melt, our water levels rise up, and the environment basically becomes more hospitable to life. This enables people to settle. And so we have our farming agricultural revolution. Now, some historians argue that people wanted to settle, so they were forced to create agricultural means of survival. Others say that they had made most of the animals extinct from hunting, and so they had to figure out a way to survive domesticating animals. Either way, it occurred. So we have the domestication and husbandry of animals, settlements arise, and with all of this, of course, comes a more stratified and hierarchical society. And so let's study some of the art that they created. Note that we are still in our prehistoric times, so we do not yet, at least, we don't have written word. So we're gonna head to Turkey, modern day Turkey, Anatolia specifically. It's the more Asian side of Turkey. And we're gonna talk about Çatalhöyük. So this is a major settlement area during our Neolithic era. Now, let's come away from the idea, again, none of these people were primitive by any means. When these settlements were created, it's not that they were living in these hippie little communes enjoying life. Human nature involves the will to survive, part of which we have to consider, like let's say this community had a failed crop and another community had a thriving crop of some specific plant or grain. And so they could either trade with one another, or in other cases where either your community will die off from the lack of food, or you would go and try to conquer the other community who had a thriving agricultural or animal means of food. So we do have essentially warfare and conflict. Now, I've been focusing on agriculture and the domestication of animals, but what we also start to see are different forms of natural resources that become valuable. And so Çatalhöyük is a good way to segue into the Neolithic period because they have obsidian, which is a hard black rock that's made from, it's volcanic rock. And so if you've seen, you can picture examples of arrowheads in your head. In North America, a lot of times that's made of flint or other stones, but it has that shiny, really sharp surface. Obsidian is very similar. It's black. Again, it's this volcanic rock. And so there's a lot in this area. Well, Çatalhöyük trades this rock because it's very valuable by other surrounding communities, and so they become wealthier. What I should have also mentioned and started with is notice the location is right along a river. Fresh water is the key to life. We are going to see this play out in different cultures of how water is revered for its importance. Our bodies are basically 70% water, so we need fresh water to survive. So these communities popped up along freshwater rivers. This also enabled trade, trading with communities upriver, downriver, etc. And so we have the beginning of these settlements. Later we'll see civilizations pop up. Okay, so back to Çatalhöyük. Now I'll give you a moment to really scan over this image of this artist's recreation of the community. And where do you notice the people are? And what do we notice about spacing between homes? Well, there's a lack of space. Most of these homes share the same wall. And if you'll notice, all these people are up on the roofs. and not really walking around. So we don't have any alleyways. We don't have spaces between the houses. The way how they would enter their homes would be from the roofs. Skipping ahead, I'm a little out of order. And they would climb down ladders into their houses. So their houses were only accessible through the roofs. There's no spacing between the houses. The reason for this is defense. Because this community had become so wealthy and they had such a valuable resource, it was built up, I'm sure through trial and error from numerous attacks, in a way that was a defensive position, essentially. So this, again, attests to these complex societies, these complex people, and again, human nature and our will to survive. And so with Çatalhöyük, what also starts to come about, and which we'll see, is compared to the art that we studied in our Paleolithic period, now we actually have some time to create art, not for necessity, but out of aesthetics, or basically the beginning of interior design, for design's sake. It may have some religious component, but because we know that they had a little bit more free time, they were settled, that we do start to see art that pops up that isn't just about necessity. So here is some of the remains. Here's an example of one of the interiors. We find bull horns everywhere, which should be familiar. Consider a hall of the bulls, and that was a common animal in our ancient cave art. The bull's going to remain an extremely important symbol. Now let's consider why this community would utilize the symbol of the bull. We have bull horns in almost every house. We have depictions of bulls on the walls. Now, if you are a powerful city and you would like to display that power or communicate that power to others, you're going to adopt a symbol. And think of and consider how powerful a bull is. These massive creatures with these sharp horns. It's already been established as an important symbol, as an important animal, and so it's utilized in Çatalhöyük. It's used as decoration. We also have it on altars. Each home seems to have had a personal altar where someone would come and worship whatever deity or religion that this community practiced. And so we see lots of bull horns. And again, like I said, we see the emergence of interior design, where they're creating art for aesthetics. This also attests to how we start to have this stratified society, this hierarchical society, where different people have different roles, where people are accumulating more wealth and can consider artists or artisans or different forms of tradesmen, etc. And so we have different roles emerging in this more complex society. Like I said, they would enter their homes through the roof, down a ladder. It's a defensive position. And here is an image, our sculpture, that we found. Here's our seated woman. A seated woman is not on your handout, but feel free to add it. Some elements of this figurine should look familiar. We have these exaggerated parts of the body that really emphasize her femininity. Of course, we also have some differences. Now, the orange of her head and the orange of the creature on the right indicates that that was a later addition. That was not original to this piece, so just FYI. But before I go into some of these details, I want to talk about where it was found. So it was found within a barrel of grain on the bottom, which may seem odd, but let's consider what our main assumption about what our Venus of Willendorf was associated with, and that was fertility, not just in human procreation, but fertility of the land, fertility of animals, for survival. And so if we pull that theme of fertility, that makes sense with this object being found in a grain barrel, the fertility of the land. So some type of hope or totem for that. She has, again, these exaggerated features, but if we'll notice, what's particularly new in this image is that she is seated. Being seated is a sign of power. We'll see this play out in other cultures. Also, at least for sure, the animal on our left, but her right, is a lion, most likely. It is a feline creature. We've already seen lions in cave art. And I mean, consider just how a lion is a very powerful creature. Again, if you're choosing symbols to indicate your power to others, the bull and the lion are key creatures to use. And so we know that this is an important object because of these symbols of power, essentially, on a seated throne or seat that's decorated with powerful animals. And we'll see this play out with our next scene in ancient Near East in particular, near Çatalhöyük. I also want to talk about this art that was on the wall of this is an artist recreation. Here's the original in the upper left. Here's another artistic rendition on the lower right with some obsidian stones in front of it so you can get an idea. But let's talk about this. If you are visiting, think of a busy city. You're walking around all day and someone tells you to try to draw that city. You're going to draw these tall skyscrapers that you're standing in front of. Your perspective is from the ground and looking at the sides of all of these buildings. Now let's consider this community. You are walking around and entering any of these buildings all from above, all from the roof. So if you were asked to draw this community, you would draw it from the roof line, from an aerial viewpoint. So the argument is that this artwork is an aerial view of the community. Now the question is, what is this orange area? So there's a few different theories about it. Those dots, hopefully as we know, it's not just happenstance, it's likely some form of graphic communication that we don't know about yet. But the orange part, one argument is that it is showing a volcanic eruption. And so this makes sense. Obsidian is a volcanic material, so we know there's a volcano nearby. And this would be an event that would be marked down. It would be a special event. Another argument, though, is that this is showing some type of leopard pelt. And that is primarily based off of other cultures, especially what comes later in Mesopotamia. And I mean, this importance of animal pelts, especially large cats, we even see in Central and South America, etc., as a symbol of power, of conquering these wild animals, of conquering these ferocious animals. So it could be either a leopard pelt, which we see in the surrounding area, or it could be a volcanic eruption, and we could have graphic communication. However, we're unsure about all of this. It's just based on educated assumptions and what we know about cultures that come next. So there we are with Çatalhöyük to introduce Neolithic art. Here is the image for size. It was obviously removed and put into the museum nearby. Okay, now let's move into Algeria. And so Algeria, we're going to study running horned women. This is our Neolithic art. We are in Africa, and we are in Tassili, Niger. This is this mountainous region. Now, originally, though, it's important to note that this would have been a much more hospitable climate. In fact, it was probably more like the Mediterranean. So it was flourishing. There were settlements nearby. Like our cave art, they weren't settled within these crevices of the cave, but the environment enabled them to have many settlements nearby, which we have archaeological evidence of. Now, along these edges, these cliff edges, etc., this mountain range, what we assume to be is like this marketplace or these religious centers that would pop up, because we have all these holes around it that show, or that likely show, how they would create these awnings. Consider any busy city and how you have these little stalls, such as food stalls, popping up to sell to the crowded areas. Have that mindset a little bit with this, of how that right along these edges of the mountains, it's not like they're necessarily living there, but there is a community. Also along a trade route, so people are coming and going. And let's come back to our running horned woman. Yeah. So it changes to an uninhabitable desert. I'm not sure why, but the only thing constant is change, is what we'll discover throughout time. And there are thousands of paintings. And we're going to focus on our running horned woman. So we have a female depicted again, attesting to her importance. Little is known about this. Obviously, we're in a prehistoric era. But we are going to take what we do know about other art, or assumptions about other art. So first of all, what we have is this main female figure, centrally placed. But if you'll also notice, there's all these other little figures, and they're overlapping. Well, what does overlapping tell us? This is the passage of time. So this area was used over a long period of time as well, and different artisans are adding on to it. We see this woman with her knees bent, hence the running aspect of it. The nomenclature could be wrong. What if she's involved in some type of movement or dance or ritual process? So sometimes the names can distract us from just analyzing the artwork more objectively. But there's a lot going on here. So we don't know what these mean. Up in the upper right portion with the solid, almost solid white and the dots that surround her head, some claim that these little dots could perhaps relate to rain, because we see dots pop up in other cultures nearby that are associated with rain. We know that water is extremely important across time and across the globe. So that could be a valid argument, but we're not sure. Now we're at the top of the screen, so let's continue to talk about her head. She's obviously wearing some type of headdress. Now consider how when we were looking at our cave art of our bird-headed man, we talked about how he could be a shaman due to that bird symbol above his head. So the assumption is that this female is likely a shaman or some type of deity. I'm not sure if that word is on your handout. D-E-I-T-Y, deity, so a god. No matter what, she is important. She is wearing all of this decorative attire, considering the armbands and sheer fabric that hangs down. She's wearing these caps or whatnot on her hands with this ribbon or string that hangs down, as well as with her legs and her skirt that she has on, and also these elements on her body. She's also in what's called twisted perspective. And so we see this in ancient Egypt, and this is where the body appears twisted. The head is in profile, the torso is in profile, but the hips, I'm sorry, let me backtrack, my bad. The head is in profile, the chest is facing forward, and then the hips and legs are in profile. Sorry, I flipped that around. So she is in a version of a twisted perspective. There is a lot of cave art in this area, or a lot of art along these mountains, depicting various scenes. I like this giraffe scene because, again, all of these people were able to create realistic art. That's not what their goal is. Their goal is communicating the concept in much of the art that we study. So the dots and the lines on her body, some argue that it may indicate scarification, if not paint, but because of other areas, other peoples in this area and around this area and around the entire continent of Africa, they would practice scarification for various purposes. Not only is it found to be aesthetically pleasing, but it can be part of ceremonial rituals, etc. And so there's an element of sacredness to it. So if we consider that she is a deity or a shaman, then this makes sense with the scarification. But again, it could also just be body paint. We may be imparting more modern notions onto the ancient world. Back, so running horned woman. There is a sense of movement, which we haven't seen as much. Again, attesting to the complexity. I should have also mentioned just the fact that we have so many humans depicted shows that we are in a different time period than the Paleolithic, because we didn't see that before. Anyway, much is unknown, but it is an interesting painting. This image helped to change the notion of ancient art. So it was shown in a more modern exhibition. In 1957, there was this exhibition in which this art was shown. And it really challenged the idea of primitive art versus fine art, in that the idea that ancient art was more primitive. And so once they actually pulled this into a museum setting, which was mostly reserved just for fine art, it challenged those notions. And so it brought to light the complexity of these ancient peoples, of these ancient artisans, and how they did have complex artistic skills and advanced artistic skills. So this helped to change our mindset and understanding of the ancient world. And the more that we discover and the more that we research into, it becomes increasingly apparent just how complex our ancient ancestors are, just like us. Human nature is complex. Okay, moving forward into our beaker with ibex motifs. So we have moved into modern day Iran. We are still in our prehistoric era. And this was found in a necropolis, which is the city of the dead, or dead city. It's actually a Greek term, so we're imparting a later word onto ancient times. But it was basically found it was a burial good found in some graves, which is common for some of the art that we'll study. This city later becomes the capital of a major kingdom, Elam. But let's focus on the artwork. So we have our beaker with ibex motifs. Well, what is an ibex? An ibex is this goat. And as you can see, the horns are stylized on this vase. It's much more geometric in pattern. Again, their aim is not to create these realistic images. This one is extremely geometric. We have these circular lines. We have these rectilinear lines, R-E-C-T-I, linear, L-I-N-E-A-R, rectilinear. So those straight lines versus those curved lines. In fact, I'll just go ahead and throw in another vocab word, curvilinear, C-U-R-V-I-L-E-N-E-A-R. I'll add this to your prehistoric resources document in D2L. Okay, so we're obviously drawn toward the center. When we're looking at the composition, so where the different elements are of this piece, our eyes are drawn to the center because of the ibex horns. They're very thick. The border of the image right above it also draws our eyes to that area, and it wraps around this beautiful little design in between the horns. We have this animal motif, but it's also symmetrical. The front and the hind areas of the body look very similar. It's stylized. So I'm throwing out a lot of new terms here. Geometric, stylized. In other words, it's not realistic. It's aesthetically pleasing. Now the circles on both sides, I'm showing you the back as well on the right, mimic one another, and they also mimic the shape of the vase. Consider if you're looking above and you've got this circular vase, or from the bottom. And so this all plays together well. It's aesthetically pleasing. It looks pleasing to the eye. Now let's look at the top. So at the top, we have this thick band that wraps around, and underneath we have what appears to be these water birds, as if they were wading in water. Think they're long necks. Think of the mini water birds that we have in Houston, etc., and they have these longer necks. Again, water is the most important element for humanity. We are near a river, so you're observing these water birds, and that element wraps around. I'm going to introduce another term, and this is register, R-E-G-I-S-T-E-R. And so what this means is that we have this clear division of different areas of the artwork from top to bottom. On the top register are our birds. We're going to go down a little bit on the front side, and we're going to look at the next register. So I'll give you a moment to observe what type of creature we're looking at. Okay, so this likely represents this type of dog that is native to the region. It's similar to a greyhound. Think of those long, skinny dogs. And so the argument that this is a dog. And then, of course, we have our next register, which takes up the most space, of our ibex and our other concentric circles. And then beneath, just some lines to indicate the bottom and the bottom register. So it's an interesting piece. But it also tells us more about their society. So we have clear indications that this was created at a workshop. There are many of them in many different graves. So with this workshop, that tells us that it wasn't that an individual needed some type of vase and hired an artisan to create this vase. Instead, they're going in like we do in modern day, and they're going to essentially like a shop of pre-made vases and buying this for these grave goods for their deceased loved one. This indicates, again, this stratified hierarchical society, different roles, different socioeconomic levels. What's also interesting is that there are slight differences within these artworks. They were all hand-drawn. So that variation also tells us that there's some artistic freedom, that they weren't confined to create these images exactly, that there is artistic freedom. They were hand-thrown or like a version of a slow wheel of pottery, but we have many of them, as you can see in this museum picture. Okay, and we will continue with our next lecture.